The following content is provided under a Creative Commons license. Your support will help MIT OpenCourseware continue to offer high-quality educational resources for free. To make a donation or to view additional materials from hundreds of MIT courses, visit MIT OpenCourseware at ocw.mit.edu.
Rashid, why don't you give us that point that you were making to me about DARPA?
Yes. So DARPA relies very heavily on this program manager structure. So they give these program managers a lot of power and a lot of leeway to do whatever they want. But they have to have a very distinct vision from the outset, like of really when they start to be able to do things. And so I was concerned that these program managers were going to basically be coming from the same places over and over again, and so have very similar visions. And you're going to be able to miss out on a lot of different talent that exists outside, or a lot of different new projects or new fields. Maybe just like we were talking about these new collaborations between biology and kind of humans and computer science, things like that. But that was really my main concern. That program managers weren't being chosen as equitably isn't the word, but that the selection process of these program managers was actually might be too narrow.
But they do get visionaries.
I mean, I think they mentioned that they only got white males.
Yeah, I wasn't managed.
Okay, so I'm going to move us to Tammy Carlton, and Tammy's big perception about DARPA is this vision perception, that's what a critical factor that makes DARPA different. And there is a process that DARPA has developed for this radical technological visioning. And essentially, she argues that there's 6 stages that they use to kind of get there. First, recruitment of great talent. And the talent, they hear about talent from this DARPA network, which is now quite huge, because all of the people that get DARPA contracts and awards, they stay in this kind of DARPA family. And typically researchers love to work for DARPA because, working on DARPA hard problems is really intriguing. So that's a community that tends to know each other and be in communication, as well as the community of former DARPA program managers and officials. So a lot of the talent comes through that network, which kind of knows what's going to work. So the recruitment and the vision get united in a way in that recruitment process. Then comes the stage of the vision formulation, right? The program manager has got to figure out what they're going to do with their 4 or 5 years. And they have got to formulate a radical vision, a right-left vision, what's going to come out of that pipeline and what's the fundamental research that's going to get me there. And it's driving for that breakthrough. That's the organizing proposition. Then they've got to go through defining a program and its launch. Often they will have a workshop, an invitation-only workshop, where they'll assemble 25, 30, 40 of the kind of best thinkers on a project area and meet for a day or 2 days. I've watched one of those which got held up at MIT as part of the beginnings of creating this biological technologies office. And they brought in just an amazing collection from MIT and from elsewhere of thinkers about what some of the early projects might be to achieve some of these capabilities. So the deputy director of DARPA came up and kind of helped run this workshop and thinks us through. The office wasn't set up for a while until the next DARPA director, but it really helped contribute to that portfolio. And it was a really serious effort. So the program manager develops a portfolio approach of standing up a series of groups that are going to be working on this and interrelating them. And the program manager is also going to be responsible for making this technology transfer. So in other words, it's not enough just to do something cool. You've got to move it into the implementation stage. And how is that going to happen? So the program manager has got to undertake all of these, various steps. So the criteria for being DARPA hard is that the project has to be technologically very challenging. It's got to extend beyond the current limits of technology and knowledge. Otherwise, they don't really want to do it. It's got to be actionable, which means it can be made, it can be built, it can be produced. So if it can't be, why do it, right? You've got to be able to demonstrate that it's actionable. Typically multidisciplinary, that it's going to draw on a variety of areas of expertise. It's got to be far-reaching. It's got to change things. It's got to be very ambitious at a big scale. Don't do little things is kind of a DARPA sub-rule. And various techniques to flesh out the vision include those expert-only workshops and a proof of concept effort. Sometimes if it's some idea looks promising, they'll do what DARPA calls a seedling. Just put a little money on it and let somebody play with it, a real thinker, play with it and see what it might materialize into. So they've got that seedling capability. There is no training system for program managers. They don't go through any kind of training, they just arrive and they kind of learn from other program managers what they're supposed to do. So there's a very strong kind of DARPA culture about how it operates that gets communicated by word of mouth and kind of learning by doing. And it's informal exchange, right? But there is a very strong kind of operating rule set. DARPA program managers really have to be quite entrepreneurial. And Martine, you were raising this earlier. They've got to stand up a whole new territory. And to do that, they've got to be highly entrepreneurial about how to bring that about. And the decision to stand up a vision program, this is not set up through peer review. There isn't consensus decision-making at DARPA. The program manager's got to have a really strong vision, and it's got to get really organized. And then it's got to withstand the office director and then the DARPA director really tearing through it and really analyzing it. So once you get that, though, the approvals can be very fast once the decision is made to stand something up. And the program manager really is, to go back to that term that you liked, Steph, a vision champion. They've got to champion this vision and make it happen. That's what the program manager's got to do. So DARPA starts with the vision. That is not how industry operates, right? That's not how other government agencies operate. Industry works largely on what's called a stage gate system. So industry is going to want to do typically more incremental kind of advances because the advances can snap onto markets that it's already got and economic opportunities that it already sees and technologies that it's already starting to explore. So it's typically going to want to do more incremental advances. And it's only going to do those incremental advances if they can, optimize them economically. So an industry R&D project has got to go through a series of stage gates, which essentially is a way of tearing down a large menu of stuff and getting to the most economically optimal. Industry's stage gate process is not a technology visioning system, right? It's not deciding on a vision and doing whatever is necessary to get there, which is the way DARPA operates. It's a much more limited set of procedural stage gates that a technology idea has got to go through. So DARPA is just working on a very different kind of organizational model from the way in which things are done, either at other agencies or within industry. And starting with this vision up front is a really interesting organizational idea that you all should kind of keep in mind when you're operating out there and setting up your own companies and doing your own startups. So Max, you've got Tammy Carlton's piece.
All right. The key step within Carlton's 5 steps that I thought was most interesting was the 5th one, technology transfer, which is supposed to bridge that the R&D, the valley of death, as it were, that enables a different scientific idea to be commercialized and to actually affect people all over the world eventually. while reading, I kind of realized that, hey, DARPA seems like they have a pretty decent organization. They get things done relatively efficiently. They have a lot of money. Why is it they have... and I just decided to start Googling just to try to figure out if DARPA had done anything related to fusion, and I couldn't find anything. So I'm curious, why not?
Actually, DARPA deferred on energy technologies to RPE.
Okay.
When RPE got stood up, because DARPA views RPE as, a compatriot. And RPE, interestingly, has done some extremely interesting work on fusion.
I know Lockheed has a project on fusion.
Right.
And they're connected to the military.
Yeah, but Lockheed Martin's,
Well, they have the Skunk Works. Which
They
is
do.
Yeah.
And DARPA's done an enormous amount of work with the Skunk Works over time, including stealth.
well, granted, yes, they definitely have the facilities. They definitely have the project managers. I just feel that it's a bit of an area outside of their expertise. They're going to accidentally make it fly instead of fuse.
Right. And look, another issue for DARPA is, remember, these technologies have got to get stood up in the lifetime of the
Which
project
is like 5
managers,
years.
like a 5-year project. So if you can't do it within 5 years, it's very hard to put it on the DARPA agenda.
Well, you mentioned that some of the projects would get handed off to other project managers. So
Yes.
that's how long a manager lasts, right?
Yes.
But it's not always how long a project lasts.
Yes, sometimes there can be intergenerational transfers. And then look, Licklider developed a different kind of system. He created a community that kept continuing with the same kind of ethos, working on that same set of agenda items, working them down one after another, and making progress year after year on each of them. So that's a different kind of way that DARPA is going to be organized. But typically, once the program manager leaves, who had the vision, their job is to get that implemented in their in effect DARPA lifetime. And if they haven't, then it's hard for DARPA to continue that, which we could view as a weakness of the program. On the other hand, you could view it as a strength.
Yeah, because then they make sure that things that if they are working, then they may proceed with it, or they pass
Right.
it off to someone else.
Right.
Yeah. So speaking of Licklider, actually, while I was reading, I noticed that Licklider had mentioned that he heavily relied on standardized tests when picking candidates, so like that recruitment of great talent. Given that literally everyone in this room has experience with standardized testing, and at least I can't speak for everyone, but I don't like it very much. I wonder which two. It was ACT.
One was like a psych test, and the other one was like intellect,
GRE.
right?
You did the GRE, it said.
Yeah. Well, there's
Yeah.
another one, but I
Yeah.
think it seemed like a psychology test. I'm not sure.
So I think that she mentioned that he was the only one who asked for test scores at all.
Yeah.
And one was a GRE, which is kind of weird.
It's just.
Remember, he was a psychologist coming out of the testing world, right? So that's probably part of the reason.
I'll chalk it up as a flaw. Because there's only so much standardized tests can tell you. They won't really tell you how you work with people. They won't tell you anything about how you work on anything that's not related to, I don't know, math or literature.
He did come up with a pretty talented team, though.
Yeah,
I
that's
don't know,
true.
you get pretty far on psychology tests, especially when it comes to leadership, because you have to figure out, for really good visionary leaders, what they'll figure out is okay, they have they're intellectuals, introverts, extroverts, and then they have a supporting type to their psyche, and they're kind of like the avatar of team groups. So it's pretty good for if you want to find out good leaders. And I know it's been pretty effective in management theory when you use psych tests. So it's also really good to figure out who's going to be a really good scientist, because it's usually highly introverted and comes up with new insights that doesn't follow the crowd. So I can see why that's important. The GRE might be, but also if your score is low, but if you've come out with a good body of work, then they can probably assume that you are pretty smart, even if you didn't do well on standardized tests. So,
Because I'm looking
I
up
would
her
be down.
LinkedIn, and it says that she has her background is in communication, and then she got a master's in public relations, and then she did a PhD in mechanical engineering design. But that must have been back in the day when the D school at Stanford accepted non-engineers and non-scientists, because now they don't. So it would be curious to think about the ways in which her background in particular might give her that insight that an engineer might not have about this particular field, right? Going back to the question of multidisciplinary great groups. But I don't know to what extent, for example, someone like me might be accepted, and maybe like Lily's lab, right?
One of the most famous women in my field has an undergraduate degree in German. So you never know.
Lloyd Blackfield, the CEO of J.P. Morgan, I think, his degree is in history, and he almost barely didn't pass. He said like he still gets nightmares because he didn't fulfill all the requirements.
Jeez.
All right, so we're going to move out of the testing world back to the DARPA world.
Sure. So one of the things that Carlton pointed out was that as DARPA has aged, so too have its project managers. Like even though they cycle between new managers every like 4 or 5 years, the average age of the managers that they would pick was going up steadily. So I'm curious if anyone has thoughts on what the effect of that would be on their managerial ability or on DARPA's direction as a whole.
Can you repeat that first part?
Yeah, so the average age of the project managers has been increasing as DARPA has.
What's the average age?
I don't remember the numbers.
27.
No, it's a lot older than that.
It's a lot.
Yeah.
One of the reasons, Max, may be that it's, watching MIT, it's very hard for younger faculty to walk out of the place, right, before they get tenure. It's hard enough to walk out once you get tenure, but it's impossible to walk out before you get tenure. And because you're establishing your research portfolio and your whole researching system, and it's very hard to walk out of that. In addition, when you go to DARPA, you've got a conflict of, once you've worked there, you have a conflict of interest with DARPA. You're not going to be able to deal with the agency for a certain period of time. So if they happen to be funding your research before, they're not going to be able to continue funding your research once you've worked there. So it's gotten more complicated for DARPA to recruit at the university level. It's gotten a lot more difficult. So the route between MIT and DARPA, frankly, used to be a lot easier to manage. And when I look at MIT colleagues here who have gone to DARPA, they are more typically fairly far along and very assured about their career and their research foundation and their writing. They've done that stuff, and they can take a 3 or 5 year break and get that really big visionary thing that they've wanted to work on forever done when they go to DARPA. But it's harder when you're trying to administer a whole research portfolio. Again, with the IPA authority, you get a certain freedom to come back to your organization and keep the day-to-day stuff going, but it's still not simple. So that may be one part of the reason that you tend to get somewhat older faculty than they probably used to at the beginning.
Liplighter wasn't especially young when he was
Right,
the
he wasn't
director,
young.
So or the project manager. So I think age does affect like the perspective that you bring in, but that it like having older people isn't a bad thing. I think in like the tech world, it's seen as like if you're not like young and hip, you're gonna be like out of touch with what's gonna work. But I don't know if that's as I think the points that Bill made about like having to kind of establish yourself and figure out what your vision is. You have more time when you're older to like have a vision.
Yeah, and perspective as well, just thinking about advisors I've had over the years and younger or newer advisors versus more established advisors. They definitely have a different perspective. And yeah, NASA is actually having the same phenomenon with having directors who are progressively older and older for that very same, they can't, it's very difficult to draw someone away from a mid-range career. If they're very, very successful and having success getting grants, then it's hard to get them into administration or directorships or management.
What has been the difference between young and older directors for you?
In general, the more established and older advisors that I've had have had a lot more perspicacity with respect to what projects are worthwhile, actually. Or
Through long experience, you're suggesting? Because they've seen a lot.
The impression, yeah, that's the impression I get.
Right. Max, how about another question?
Sure. All right. So, so Carlton mentioned that DARPA, in order to save time when they were trying to develop these projects, they tried to discourage consensus, which I didn't really see as a, I think it was the next slide you have. Yeah, so like I understand why, because then it ensures that whatever you're trying to develop, it gets done quickly. But just because it gets done quickly doesn't really mean that it gets done right. So I guess I was curious what people thought on the specifically that decision.
You know, it's a very interesting point, Max. And actually, RPE, and we'll talk about it when we get to RPE, and the energy class. But RPE does have a process. It's a much smaller agency, so it's 300 million, not 3 billion, like DARPA. So it's like a big DARPA office, you know, sizable DARPA office, one of its 5 or 6 offices. So RPE does have a consensus process. They bring in, they call them project directors, but they're program managers. And that community really, you have to present your vision to that community. And that's a very tough-minded group and a very sophisticated group. And the director is quite sophisticated at DARPAs, at RPEs historically as well. So they did a variation on this. At DARPA, it's much more convince your office director, and then the office director will work with you on convincing the director of DARPA. It's a simpler, more straightforward process. You do get support from other program managers who will have a lot of advice and ideas for you, so it's a pretty supportive operation. Nobody's in competition with each other. They're there to help each other, so that's a positive. Although, again, they're competing to achieve their vision, and everybody kind of knows who's getting their vision done and kind of who is in trouble with their vision. So that's kind of known and understood. There's a certain kind of competition in that way, but it's not a direct one-on-one competition with each other. But at RPE, there is more of consensus decision-making. And, you know, Lu Yao, when she was telling us about Xerox PARC, remember your whole discussion about the dealer process and having to bring your idea to the whole team sitting around on beanbags who would tear it apart. That's kind of a consensus process. It's a definite, tough-minded review process that DARPA doesn't really quite have. So there may be strengths and weaknesses in both models. Max, what do you think on that?
Yeah, I could see there being strengths and weaknesses to both, but it just feels if you have less consensus, then you have less. If you have fewer people that are trying to discuss these ideas, then there might be some critical flaw that you might just miss, just because there are fewer people with more diverse experiences. Of course, if you have a decent idea of the science behind it, and it's not something as untested as fusion, for example, then I could see it working pretty well. If you had to do that I could see it having problems with something untested like stealth, but apparently they made it work. So maybe they're passing my expectations.
To add like a Silicon Valley perspective, like it's pretty common mantra to say like you want to have an idea that people kind of say is not a good idea, because like the idea is if you're coming up with something that's pretty innovative, most likely people won't agree with it, or it doesn't make sense, or you have an insight that other people don't get. Also, if you're an expert, you probably know some things that other people don't know that you'd have to bring them up to speed on, especially if it's in a completely new area. And so the history has been, they're just saying that for new fields, who is the expert, right? It wouldn't be a PhD because the field hasn't been invented yet. It's this person who just started working on it. So Bill Gates was an expert on software for personal computers before that even became a thing. So it's very common consensus is actually really bad because you put down these ideas based on new insights. So.
Yeah, and another issue with consensus is you have to assume, or you have to have a group in which all members have the personality type that they will concede to someone else's idea or to give consensus, even if it's not their pet project or their favorite. You know what I mean? And some people aren't disposed to do that, no matter what. It's tough.
How about a closing thought on this one, Max?
Sure. So overall, I feel that DARPA seems to have been a pretty great success. They've made lots of really cool projects. They do it very quickly. I'm not sure how cheaply they do it, but they get it done. And because of that continued success, I feel that that's probably why they've continued to get so much funding. I really try to emphasize that technology transfer aspect because it ensures that the technology that they develop isn't just, oh, it's a nice new toy for the military to have. It ensures that whatever they make from the internet, GPS, etc., that everyone can use it and that it makes our entire society better. So, yeah, I guess that's pretty much just why I like DARPA.
Great. There's a lot of MIT folks who feel the same way you do. All right, let me do a quick wrap up of today's class. So we did Mitch Waldron's book, and it's really, I really wanted to kind of portray the governmental role in supporting the earlier stages of the evolution of computing. It was a proving ground for new concepts and designs and architectures. The Defense Department created an initial market for a lot of the new products and services, and in fact, whole industries. This greatly expanded university research capabilities, the computing revolution. And, it was done to further governmental missions, but it had obviously a dramatic societal effects. So it featured governmental agencies playing a pretty central role. DARPA, as we discussed, was critical, but some of the others were necessary and needed. And the governmental agencies sponsored these industry-university collaborations that led to great strength in the university side and focus areas around them. So in the reading that we did from the textbook, the essential point here was that DARPA was uniquely able to combine an innovation institutional role as well as a great groups innovation at the face-to-face level kind of role. That's a remarkable accomplishment. And then DARPA's ability, as we talked about in that reading as well, to innovate in a legacy sector, to do a frontier sector like IT, but also innovate within a legacy sector and do things like stealth and UAVs. That's a pretty fascinating organization that's flexible and interesting and able to do great stuff. Glenn Fong's piece was really about DARPA playing the central institutional mobilization role for the IT revolution, and Tammy Carlton's piece really told us about this kind of central importance of technology visioning as a key modus operandi that DARPA has been able to operate in. Any closing questions? Good luck with your paper outlines. Let me know if you have questions, and I look forward to seeing you on Tuesday.